everyone, in this video I'm going to show how I painted this ginger kitten in acrylics. Now the first thing I like to do is start with the background, and this makes it much easier for painting the subject on top. If we paint the subject first and then try coming back in with the background, we are of course then going to blend over those sections of fur, or in this case the blanket as well, on those outer edges. So having the background established in place initially and then starting with the subject, I find much easier. Now once that background is completely dry, I can then start with the subject, and I usually begin with the eyes. Now my first priority here is to capture the three-dimensional shape of the eye. I'm not looking at the exact colour here, it's more about the lights and the darks. Now a big tip when painting any eye is to focus on the shading. This of course is going to vary from each individual reference photo and the light source, but in most situations there is going to be darker shading that is required on the outer edges of the eye itself. Now what this will do is it will capture more of the sphere shape rather than the eye looking flat and more two-dimensional. Once that darker base and the shading is dry, I can then come in here with my lighter colours and then start hinting at my midtones and of course then those brighter values. Now one of the wonderful things about working with the acrylics is that there is that endless possibility of being able to layer more and more of the lighter values on top. As long as the base layers underneath are dark enough, those highlights will look nice and bright. We don't have to worry about those layers getting muddy as long as it is all dried underneath. We can really continue to layer here until the desired level of depth and realism is achieved. Now as I progress onto painting the fur, a big part of this section of the tutorial was how to capture a more vibrant colour saturation without getting a muddy layer or losing the depth. What I don't want here is the fur to be the same colour all over, but I also don't want to have to put so much stress and emphasis on that it makes that painting process really stressful. Now one of the ways that I prefer to do this is to work in many layers, and you'll see that here, but also adjust the colour with the use of glazes. Now this is something that I do cover thoroughly in all of my acrylic painting tutorials, along with how to use the brush, all of the tiny little specific brush technique changes that do have a big impact to how realistic the details and that layering process looks. Now if any of my step-by-step real-time lessons are of interest, I'll link all of the information to those in the description below. Because I record those with a voiceover while I'm painting, everything is very step-by-step, which makes even the most complex subjects easier to tackle. Now back to the layering process here, the base foundation is something that I emphasise in all of my YouTube videos as well. Here, I don't want to be jumping to my details if my base layer isn't correctly established and it isn't soft enough. Now the softness of my base layer I personally feel makes a massive difference to how soft the details look on top. Which is why when I come back in with this second layer, it's pretty much a rinse and repeat process of the very first layer, but look how much different it is in terms of the softness. This is such a big factor for how realistic those details look when added at the next stage. Now something else that I do like to focus on at this base layer stage is the importance of the highlights and shadows. As you can see here, I'm not trying to get my brightest value in early on. I want to save that for my later layers. But what I am doing here is establishing where my highlights and shadows should be positioned. Now the reason this is something that I feel is important to hint at this first stage is because this determines the accurate shape and form of the subject we're painting. Whether or not it's an animal or a person, this is something that will have a massive impact in the end result and how realistic it's going to be. Now, if for example the highlight above the eye was positioned too higher up, it would therefore make it look like the cat was able to raise one of its eyebrows, and that of course would change the expression massively. So this is why I like to really focus on it, and if I do feel like something's not quite right, I will always take the time to adjust that placement of the highlight or shadow before I move on to the next layer. Now as I begin to move on here, this is where I'm going to focus more on the fur direction. I've already started to hint at that in the layer previous, but this is where I'm going to focus more on the length of my brush strokes, the thickness of my brush strokes, and as I say, that direction. Now the fur direction is not random, it's also following the bone structure underneath the skin. So just like with the placement of the highlights and shadows, I want to be making sure that I've got this accurate. Now depending on the size of the painting, we can't add all of the changes of fur direction. We may only be able to add in the main ones. But I want to be making sure that if I've got a fur directional change over a main structure, such as the eye socket or the cheek or the jaw, that I want to capture those because they're going to have more of an impact in the smaller painting or that smaller section. Now, although this was a 12 by 16 size painting, so it's not small, but it's not massive either, the blanket actually took up far more than the kitten itself. And you can see that from the photo in the corner of the finished painting. So I had to be very realistic with how much detail I can include here. Now at this point, I'm going to be using glazes to adjust my colour. There are many times, such as now, that this actually looks a little bit too muted. It certainly doesn't have that orange colour that is seen in the finished painting. Now the reason that this is the case is throughout my layering process, I will focus more on the values. I don't have to worry about the exact colour and the lightness or darkness of that colour at the same point. I can actually do this in two separate processes and you'll see that in the next few seconds. So as I'm coming back in and adding more of my highlight, establishing more of my contrast, which is really, really important when aiming for realism, once that layer has completely dry, I can then come back in with a glaze to adjust that colour. Now the use of a glaze for many situations can actually enhance the level of softness as well. As you can see here, it is going to darken some of those lighter values I've put in, but I actually want that to encourage more of that depth within the fur. So by darkening this up, and again always reinforcing the contrast, that difference between the highlights and shadows, this is going to maximise the level of realism, especially on these smaller paintings. Now regardless of the size of the painting, contrast is something that I feel is so important, more so than the exact colour. One main reason for this is if this photo of this cat was taken a couple of minutes later, maybe the lighting had changed, even if it was taken outdoors versus indoors. These are things that are going to affect the exact colour that we can see in the fur. For example, of your own pet, you've probably got hundreds of photos on your phone, but the colour of that fur is going to look different in many situations and different settings, which is why I want to focus more on the contrast. Now, colour is important. It's not something that we should completely forget about, but I do feel that by breaking it up into the separate layering process with working with the values, focusing on the contrast, and then adjusting the colour with a glaze, enables us to prevent that overwhelming feeling of having to mix the exact colour at each layer. This can actually make the painting process far more complicated than it needs to be. Now, of course, there are many different ways to get to the same end, so if you are an artist that does like to work with mixing the exact colour at each stage, that is of course absolutely fine. But if you do feel more overwhelmed with that layering process and which colour we should be using at each layer, then working with individual glazes separately can make a huge difference to how much easier these more complex paintings are to approach. Now again, this is one area where I'm still focusing on my base foundation. Even though it's a very small section of this, barely an inch, inch and a half wide, I do still want to make sure that I'm hinting at the lights and the darks. Now one thing that is often exaggerated when painting cats is that we may have a tendency to curve up the lower part of the mouth, so it can actually make it look like it's got more of an exaggerated smiley expression. Now this often isn't the case. You may have some shading that curves upwards, but that's usually more subtle. We don't want to have too many of the darker values at those corners because that can massively affect that expression, as I've mentioned. So this is something that whenever I work on the mouth portion of any cat, regardless if it's a domestic cat or a bigger cat such as a tiger or a lion, I do want to make sure that I've got that right. Now once I'm happy with the placement and the position of the lights and the darks, this is where I focus on the fur or the brush technique. Now one big consideration here is how much shorter the brush strokes should be. You can see here that they may only be 1 millimetre or 2 long compared to 0.5 centimetre on the top of the face. This is something here where that variation is going to also impact how realistic the painting looks. So it is really important when aiming for a high level of realism that the length of the fur is adjusted from each individual section as much as possible. Now, something else to consider, especially when working on the bridge of the nose, is that the fur there is so short that in some situations there may be no detail visible at all. It might require more of the use of shading techniques and focusing more on the softness rather than individual lines. Again, this is going to vary depending on the reference photo that we're working from and the size of the artwork. If this painting was done on an 8x10 size, so much smaller, then the bridge of the nose there I wouldn't include as much detail as I have on this size, because the cat in relation to that would be significantly smaller. Now, when I work with glazes, I usually like to make sure that I'm happier with that end stage before I move on to another section. If I add a glaze and I feel like it's covered up too much of the highlights, then I can come back in with one more additional layer before I move on. Now, I usually say that each section is about 80 or 90% complete. I don't ever get it 100% because there's always times that I come back and rework it when more of the painting is established. So where I was happy with the face, I knew I needed to add more highlights, but I felt like I needed to move on. I'm now working on the ears. Now, the layering process is the same, but of course the lights and the darks have changed. So I want to focus on the darker inner sections of the ear, and then it gets lighter as it gets towards the edges. Again, this is going to vary depending on the light source, but typically with animals that have upright ears such as this, I want to be making sure that that centre is darker so that I've hinted at a bit more of the concaved appearance and the positioning of that ear. Now, if the centre of this ear was as light as the edges, again, it's going to look very flat and two-dimensional. Having this darker centre and the highlights on the edges, even if it is just slightly lighter, is going to really enhance that level of realism. Now, as I've worked on both of the base layers for the ears here, you can really see the importance of that light source. The left ear is significantly lighter than the right, and I really wanted to make sure that I continued to establish that as the layers were built up. Now, something that I want to mention here, because it is crucial in the layering process, is if you start adding your details such as the inner ear hairs and you feel like they're not visible but they should be showing up more, that's an indication that the layers underneath aren't dark enough. One thing that we don't really want to do here is just add more titanium white, for example, to make that paint lighter if the main issue is that the layers underneath aren't dark enough. Now, if you're happy with the base layer and you feel they are dark enough, then yes, adding more of a lighter colour to that paint for the details is what's required. But one question that we should always ask is that showing up because the layer underneath is too light? If we feel it's too light, it's easier at this stage to then go in and darken it and come back in with those details than not make those changes and have to then feel at the end of the painting that it's a little bit flat. Now, by darkening up a layer, you can do that with a simple glaze, and I do have a video here on YouTube where I'm showing all the different uses and how I like to use glazes in my acrylic paintings. If that video is of interest, I'll link that in the description below. Now, at this stage here, I was feeling that I needed to then have a little bit of a break, rest my eyes, and the times that we take away from a painting are just as crucial as the time painting itself. Now, if we continue to work on one piece or one specific area, especially if we're starting to get tired, that's when we can start to cut corners and make decisions in that layering process which will have a negative impact in the depth and realism. Now, most of the time, if I do feel like I'm getting a little bit tired, even just 15-20 minutes away from the painting is enough to go back with fresh eyes. But after I'd finished a larger section such as the face, it's not uncommon for me to then put that painting away for a day, even work on something else in between times. Now, I don't usually recommend to work on multiple paintings at the same time because I personally find that I get then excited about the next painting and I lose interest in something that I was working on previously. So I do have a rule that I like to work on the next acrylic painting only when I've got the previous acrylic painting done, which is why I like to work in different mediums. So if I was starting to get tired at this stage, but I wanted to then work on something else the following day, I can then work with graphite or pastels. Now what I've decided to do for the YouTube version of this tutorial is I'm going to just finish working on the neck here, and then I'm going to add the whiskers in this section, and then I'm actually going to upload the blanket portion of this painting in a separate video that I'll probably get uploaded next week. Now that video is going to focus on all of the techniques that I've used for painting that soft fleecy blanket, and the blending application of the paint there was crucial. So if you do have any specific questions about painting fabric of any kind, then let me know in the comments below and I'll get those answered in that video when it goes live. So I do hope this video has been of interest. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It will make a huge difference to my channel. And I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you are interested in painting along to the real-time version of this, then as I've said, all of the information to those are linked in the description below. If you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.